Good, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the NCGE webinar. Today is the day before Halloween, October 30th. So thank you for coming. If you have little ones you're getting ready for, good luck with that. The National Council for Geographic Education believes that geography education is a bridge to a better understanding and appreciation of all subject matters. NCGE is a nonprofit organization that is committed to ensuring that all students graduate with the knowledge, perspective, and skills to make informed decisions as they go through life. They support all educators in their desire to create engaging, authentic, inquiry-based learning experiences for students at all levels. And I'm thrilled to have with us tonight from West Virginia, Karen Culcasi, to share with us some of her research on the Syrian Palestinian refugees, which, as we know, is a very important topic right now. And hopefully we can get some information. I know we will get some information that we will be able to take into our classrooms to help our students understand this very complicated issue. So Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself further. And thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that. Karen Culcasi, I've been professor at WVU for 17 and a half years. I'm trained in geography. I was working on this project off and on for about 10 years, and it culminated into a book recently. What else about me? I got a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old, a dog, 2 cats, husband, all that good stuff. So I'm actually hiding out back in my office because they're really loud this time of night. So I had to run away from my house. Would you all mind just turning your cameras on for a quick sec and like kind of give me a little wave? So I like humans, and maybe just a super quick introduction to maybe like what you teach, or what level, and yeah, maybe where you're physically located as well would be awesome. All right, Greg, I think you're up first.
Yeah. Greg, you're the only one. Let's go.
Well, good evening. Greg Hill. I teach high school geography, African American studies at Horn High School, Mesquite, Texas. And I'm actually going to school down the street from you, Karen, at Marshall.
Oh, you're at Marshall, really? I think I see an M pop up behind your head.
Yeah, there it is.
There it is. Yep. I thought that's what I saw. Excellent. Great.
And I just bought your book.
Oh, you did? Okay. Ooh,
Yeah.
I hope it goes okay.
So far, so good.
Good. Nice to meet you, Greg.
Sandra, go ahead.
All right, I'm Sandra. I'm in New Jersey. I teach at Hillsborough High School. I'm teaching the AP Human Geography course that I've built from only one session all the way up to 3 sections a day, and I teach world history.
Awesome. My daughter's going to take that next year. I wanted her to take it this year, but she's like, she's taking APUSH, the history class. So she's like, it's too much. But yeah,
I've already told my son that will be the one class I will make him take.
Yeah, I can't wait. All right, it was nice meeting you.
And we have a couple of people introducing ourselves in the chat. So Jody's here from Sitka, Alaska, and Paulina looks like she's a student at George Washington University. Ailey, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm a student and I'm taking the class of Anthropology of War Ecologies. So I'm just very interested in this topic and like I'm here as a student.
Okay, great. I'm not going to really be touching onto ecologies, but I have been recently, like in my own research, been working towards like what I'm calling environmental geopolitics. So that would be very similar, I think, to kind of war ecologies, but that's not going to be here today. Sorry to disappoint you. All right. Well, I guess that's everybody. A little small audience today, I guess, Julie, maybe. Yeah. Okay. It is what it is, right? Okay. So here we go. My talk titled Displacement and Belonging, focus on Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Jordan. I'll return to this image at the end of the talk and explain what's actually going on here. Okay, before I actually get into talking about the details of the work I did with Syrian and Palestinian refugees, I'd like to start from a very global context. And as geographers, you know that context is incredibly important when you're looking at a case study, but actually to look at a little larger and a little bit more comparatively. So as of 2023, there are 117.3 million forcibly displaced people globally. That is an astronomically high number. It started to creep up at a very, very steep level in 2012 with the Syrian war. At that time, it was at 60 million. So it's nearly doubled just in the 10 years since the Syrian war actually began. Now, this is forcibly displaced people, which is a very, very large category that includes official refugees, asylum seekers, and people who are also displaced internally within their own countries, right? So it's a very large encompassing number, and not always are these people necessarily refugees, but they are people that are seeking protections and are in need of some type of humanitarian assistance because they have been forced to flee their homes. Okay. Oh, and it's a little context about 117 million. The state of California has a population of 39 million people. So that is 3 Californias, the population. So very large. Okay. So where they actually come from, where the conflicts are across the globe that is producing the majority of these refugees primarily are coming from 10 different states, 3 of which are even highest on the list here. And those are Ukraine, which has been 2 years, Syria, which again started in 2011, and Afghanistan, which has had a couple different kind of movements of refugees, but after the US withdrawal in the summer of 2022, that number has spiked immensely. Other countries, Myanmar, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, the DRC, and as Central African Republic also are large contributors to this 117 million refugees across the globe. Now, a little bit more of the context of this global refugee problem that we have. The numbers here on this map do not include Venezuelan or Palestinian refugees. That 117 million does include those, though. And those are those reasons are because the UNHCR, the branch that oversees in the UN all refugees, because they actually don't count certain refugees depending on the cause of the conflict and what receiving states will label them. So it becomes very political and very individual to the receiving states. But if we add if we add Venezuelans, there are about 7 million Venezuelan refugees. And if we add Palestinians, there's 6 million Palestinian refugees. Those are actually part of the 117, but they're not actually on this map. So again, as geographers, I think it's important to understand what the map might be missing. And here it's missing Venezuelans and Palestinians. Okay. So where did they go? That's where they started. That's where they're coming from. And where did they go? So this graph here in the map that's, it's not a very prominent map here, but this map is actually showing the countries where the majority of these refugees are going. And we see here, Iran and Turkey are by far the largest receiving states, followed them by Germany. And that's only really been the case since the war in Ukraine. Germany did take in Syrian refugees, but the number really grew much, much higher with the war in Ukraine. And then Pakistan, Uganda, very poor countries. Russia is up there. They've actually been taking in people from Ukraine that are calling themselves Russian. Poland, and then Bangladesh. And then the next 6 countries are also very poor developing countries. Let's move my screen here, sorry. Sudan, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Chad are the next countries in here in receiving, and the numbers of refugees that they're receiving. And then after that, at number 13 is Jordan, where I did research off and on for about 10 years. So Jordan ranks actually 13th on this list, but if Palestinians were included here, they would actually be number 1, meaning that they host more refugees than any other country in the entire world. This, though, needs to put into larger global north, global south context that the poorer countries of the world are hosting 75% of all the world's refugees, which is just an astronomical number. If you think about the fact that these countries have a lot less resources and a lot less wealth to actually be enacting these humanitarian processes, it's incredibly remarkable that they are hosting 75%. The 6 wealthiest countries in the entire world, and wealthy here is actually being defined by the size of their economy. So that's United States, China, Japan are in the top. They're hosting only 9% of the world's refugees. So the wealthiest countries in the world are not doing that much, whereas the poorer countries in the world are doing an incredibly large amount. So here again, we begin to focus a little bit more on Jordan. Again, 13th on this list, but it'd be first if they included Palestinians in the numbers. Jordan's economy of 177 countries who have ranked economies, they are 89th. It's not a country of destitute poverty, but it is absolutely a poor country compared to, what we're accustomed to in many other places. I have so many pop-ups on my screen right now. Okay, so I'm going to move into a little bit more focused discussion, particularly about Jordan. First, I'm going to talk about the Palestinian refugee population there because it is the largest. So Jordan's population as a whole is a little over 10 million people, of which about half of that population, or 5 million people, are actually Palestinian. And majority of these actually do have the status of refugees. Also, of these 5 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan, the majority of them are citizens. Not all of them, but the very, very large majority they are. And therefore, they're counted in as part of this 10 million population. Now, the Palestinians came in two different stages. One was in 1948. That was when Israel declared itself an independent state and initiated a conflict that ended up displacing 750,000 Palestinian people, of which they were dispersed throughout the new country of Israel, through territories that were still Palestinian, as well as to Lebanon and to Syria primarily, a few to Egypt, and then a lot went to Jordan. And then the second stage of Palestinian refugee migrations into Jordan came in 1967. That was during the war that Israel initiated, called the Six-Day War. That was a very quick war where Israel conquered and took over the Golan Heights of Syria. It took over the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, and it took over the territories we hear a lot about in the news today. That's the West Bank of Palestine and the Gaza Strip of Palestine. So during both of these major conflicts in Israel-Palestine, Jordan ended up receiving a lot of Palestinians, to the point that now that they've had children, they're numbering at least 5 million. So this is a photograph of one camp that was established in 1967. It's known as the Al-Hassan camp, and it still exists today. It looks very, very, very different, but it still exists very much today. All right. Of all of these 5 million Palestinian refugees, about a third of them are registered with UNRWA. UNRWA is the United Nations organization that deals specifically with Palestinian refugees. The UNHCR, which I mentioned in that previous slide, they deal with all the other refugees in the world, but the Palestinian ones, because it's so large and because they were actually forcibly displaced prior to the creation of the UNHCR, they have their own agency, which can cause quite some confusion because they have slightly different mandates, but about a third of them are registered. Of all the Palestinians today in Jordan, about 18% of them live in refugee camps. There's 13 refugee camps throughout Jordan. 18% live in them. And they don't look like this picture anymore. They're no longer just tents, but they're actually turned into semi-permanent housing. They are often, I've been to several, they feel like kind of low-income housing. And the camps are entirely open. There are no gates, there are no fences, there are no checkpoints. Refugees come and go, and non-refugees can come and go. So here's a picture of the Al-Hassan refugee camp, the same one that is pictured above in 1967. And this is a photograph I took of the Al-Hassan camp in maybe 2018 or so. So you can see over the course of many decades how a refugee camp can grow and become, well, rather permanent, even though the idea, the entire concept of a camp is something of being temporary, but here we see it's become quite permanent. Okay, the other populations we have in Jordan, refugee populations, these are not included in the total population of 10 million people in Jordan. The largest of the other refugee populations are Syrians. There are 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Jordan. This refugee movement began in 2011 with the Syrian civil war. And the refugee numbers in Jordan peaked in 2014 and 2015. About half of these are registered with the UNHCR. The other half are not for various reasons, which during Q&A, I'm more than happy to answer. 16% of them live in camps, which is even less, just slightly, but even less than the Palestinian ones. The camps with Syrians, though, there are two major camps that the UNHCR had built in collaboration with the Jordanian government. These camps are very unlike the Palestinian ones. I am just saying the Palestinian ones are open. There's free mobility in and out of these camps. The Syrian ones actually function more like detention camps or open air prisons. They are closed off, they're militarized. It is very difficult for Syrians to get out. It's a very complicated process to get them out. It is possible, but it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. I guess I can answer questions about that if anyone's interested later. Let me just take a second here to explain this photograph that you're looking at. This very much demonstrates this how securitized and militarized the camps have come, the Syrian camps are. This is a photograph I took of a little playground, and there was actually a mother and a child further to the right, but I cut them out. And I had to play around with the picture a lot and blow it up to make it so it was visible. But you obviously see the playground in the foreground. There's some swing sets here. It's sponsored by UNICEF and Mercy Corps. In the back, which you really can't see where my mouse is going right here. Actually, maybe my mouse is better over here. My mouse is going over here. It's actually a fence that's about, it was 10, maybe 12 feet tall. But then what you can actually see pretty clearly behind it is this shelter here, which is built to keep the sun off of the tank. Because the perimeter of this camp, this is the Zatri refugee camp, it is highly militarized. And after there's fences, there are sometimes, not in this particular location, there's these sand berms, like artificial sand hills, which are incredibly difficult to run over. And then in some locations, they actually do have these tanks where soldiers will stay the entire day monitoring the camp to make sure no one gets out. So very, very different than the Palestinian camps. But again, only 16% of Syrians live in the camps, which means that 84% of them are in the towns and cities. And this is a typical type of an apartment complex that Syrians are renting. A huge majority of them are living in rather impoverished conditions. They were forced to flee their homes. They haven't been able to work. Some of them had some savings with them, but most of them are living rather impoverished. So this is this woman sticking her head over the balcony right now. We're coming up to interview her earlier stage in my project. So this is typically what they're living at, even though the camps are rather militarized. The rest of life for the huge majority of them it's much freer. In addition to the Syrians, there's about 10,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria that are in Jordan. So this means that during 1948 or 67, they were displaced from Palestine and they went to Syria. And then with the Syrian war, they displaced from Syria and they came into Jordan. So we call these doubly displaced refugees because they've had to move twice. But 10% of those are registered. There are also a huge number of Iraqi refugees, kind of. The term that the Jordanian government uses actually calls them guests. They refuse to actually give them refugee status, although the UNHCR does consider them refugees and they are counted as part of that 117 million. It's super difficult to get a real number on how many because of the way in which the Jordanian government actually labels them. So here I'm telling you, saying a low of 29,000 or up to 250,000. So it's a huge range, obviously. But very prominent in the cities. There are no refugee camps for Iraqis. They all integrated directly into the cities. A lot of them brought some wealth with them, and they've actually established a lot of businesses and have done actually really quite well for themselves in the sense of like income and economic status. Okay. And then in much, much smaller numbers are Ethiopian, Somali, and Afghan refugees, but these are much smaller numbers. All right. So the book I wrote has many, many different points in it. I'm going to try to just summarize some of the key things here, things I hope that you would find, interesting, for your own enrichment, but also like to help, teach your own classes. There's a couple I'm going to really emphasize and some I'm not so much. So one of my major points of the book overall is that here in Jordan, refugees are the norm. Half of them are Palestinian refugees, 1.5 million Syrians. I mean, they're not the exception. They are actually the norm. And in countries like the United States and a lot of EU countries, refugees are vilified as being threatening, as being potentially dangerous. And that's just not how it is in Jordan. Many other of the receiving countries that take 75% of the refugees in, they don't see refugees that way. They see refugees as people who need some assistance. That's not to say there's not tensions in Jordan with refugees. There's a lot of economic issues that come with hosting a huge amount of refugees, like the price of rents increased a lot with Syrian refugees. Schools went to like a double shift. The teachers were really stressed out because now they're teaching tons of other students. Like there's certainly problems, but the overall perception of refugees is not one that they're threats. Again, challenging economically, but not a threat. Jordan is absolutely remarkable. It gained its independence from Great Britain in 1946. And in 1948, just 2 years later, was that first war when Israel declared its existence. So they have except for 2 years of their entire history, they've been more or less defined by being a refugee hosting state. And in that way, Palestinians are a part of the absolute fabric, economic, social, political fabric of Jordan. They have, though, become more restrictive as of 2012, 1 year into the Syrian war. They became just absolutely overwhelmed, and that's why Zotri and the other camp exist as militarized camps, because they just got very, very overwhelmed. But again, they're still letting 84% of the Syrians in the towns and cities. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, like this hyper securitization, but also incredible mobility and integration. What I really try to tell what do in this book is really try to tell the story of resilience and strength. Although refugees can very much be positioned and viewed as threats to a country, another way they're often viewed is that they're victims. And as victims, they just need our help, right? And they end up being a burden. That's not really the case with the huge majority of the world's refugees. In fact, they have overcome some of the most challenging things you could ever imagine. The resilience and the strength of these people, men and women, children, it's just remarkable. And it's also very much a story of humanitarianism and of Jordan's policies of integration. So I try to have a very kind of positive view of what's been happening in Jordan. Now, this is a point I will get into a little bit more as I move along in my talk here, that most of these refugees I was talking about in the two previous slides, they're Arabs, meaning that they come from a country that has, Arabic is a dominant language, and they define themselves as having an Arabic ethnicity and culture. They have a long history as kind of recognizing themselves with Arabs. It's only the Ethiopians, the Somali, and the Eritreans that don't identify as Arab. And that has a huge amount of significance for these refugees, because they basically see themselves as moving from one Arab country to another, and they know the language. So it's a really, really important aspect of the story I'm telling in this book. So I was asked to really kind of focus on notions and ideas of belonging, which is great, because I asked people lots and lots about how they feel like they belong. And when I was talking about belonging, I was doing it very much as a geographer. I was really interested in places and territories. You see the title of my book is actually Territory. It's actually kind of really focused on this notion of territory. I'm not going to do that for my talk today, but that's a lot what I meant by belonging, is how people feel a sense of belonging to place, to geography, to territory. There's lots of other ways we have a sense of belonging, right? You know, a sense of belonging to communities, to faith, whatever it might be. But for here, I really was being a geographer and thinking about place. So where they feel they belong, of course, like maybe this is not the most profound thing to say, but it has an immense impact on where they choose to move and where they choose to settle. And when they're settling, how they actually cope and how they manage and how they're able to be resilient and have this strength. So it's geography ends up being incredibly important to the story. Okay, so I'm going to start first with kind of focusing on that connection of identifying as Arab. The people that are the Syrians and the Palestinians who are in the country of Jordan kind of all recognize themselves not just as Arab, but being part from the same area, and they have this very long history. So for a period of 620 years, almost exactly, this area that you see on the map here was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was actually larger at its greater extent. It went across much of North Africa, but just prior to its demise with World War I, this was the extent of the Ottoman Empire. So the area that I have outlined here in this rectangle here is more or less the area that I studied. It includes Jordan, as well as Syria, where refugees came from, as well as Israel and Palestine. It also includes Lebanon, which is this northerly area up here, which I did not study Lebanese movements, or because they really haven't actually been, they haven't been refugees. They've taken in tons of Syrian refugees though. But this is a general area where people had seen themselves as being very united, sharing a very similar history and culture. Okay, so during World War I, the Ottoman Empire joined the side of the Austrian-Hungarian and the German empires, which were the ones that were fighting against the English, the French, and eventually the Americans when the Americans do join the war. And therefore, they found themselves on the losing side of the war. And in 1918, at the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was divided up. Turkey was created out of like the main Anatolian Peninsula up here to the north. But the British and the French, as the victors of the war, the United States actually did not declare war on the Ottoman Empire. But the British and French looked at the rest of the Ottoman Empire and was like, okay, how are we going to divide this up? At this point, during the end of World War I, they knew there was a lot of oil in the region. And they also, at least for Great Britain, were incredibly keen on protecting their interests in this region because of the feature right here, which is the Suez Canal, which allows people, you don't have to circumvent the entire continent of Africa in order to admit it to their crown jewel of India. So they end up taking this area that had been connected. There had never been borders. There was never any conception of there's one country and a different country. It's all very united. The Ottomans had a system where they divided their territory or their land. They didn't call it territories really. Their lands into like provinces, but people's identities weren't appended to a province. The provinces were only used so they could collect taxes, but it wasn't about people's identity. There were never borders or new walls. There's nothing like that. It was very, very open and zonal and fluid and very nomadic. So the French ended up creating, these countries never had existed before. They created the country of Syria and Lebanon. Those were French territories. The British got Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. And it was indeed called Palestine. It wasn't until 1948 that it was referred to as Israel. And the British it was called the Palestine Mandate, and they called it Palestine. So these are countries, so other than the borders, they exist on the map, right? And they never actually existed before. So for all these people that once very united, all of a sudden there's borders. So every single time a Syrian or Palestinian crossed over borders to come into Jordan during the different waves of migration that have happened, they were literally crossing over borders that were not even 100 years old. In the case of Palestinians, much, much earlier than that. And they were created by the French and the British. So they were in a lot of ways very meaningless borders, or they were borders that they knew were forced upon them by European powers that, and they had no decision making in that process. So they were borders they didn't care for, to say the least. So because of that, and I talked to a lot of Palestinians and Syrians in Jordan that both said the same thing. This area that had been kind of vaguely defined, it was referred to as Bilad Hashem, and it still is referred to today as Bilad Hashem, which means the country of Syria. The real translation of that, though, is Greater Syria, like the literal is country of Syria, but it really means Greater Syria. And that region, again, including what is modern-day Lebanon, is what people generally consider to be Bilad Hashem. It was never clearly defined and outlined. They didn't think of territory the way we do in modern kind of mapping political maps of the world. It was, again, much more zonal and nomadic and fluid. But this was the area, Bilad Hashem, and people really had a lot of identity connecting themselves to this region. So even 100 years later, 1919 was when this was all divided up and finalized. 100 years later, people that I interviewed still talked about this as being really where they feel connected and where they feel they belong. So I have a couple quotes. I'm going to do this for the next several slides, where I just quote some of the interviews that I conducted. So this one Syrian man was talking about his sense of belonging and why he felt going from Syria to Jordan was very natural. He refers to Bilad Hashem. He says, without any borders, this is my homeland. Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, they're all my countries. Iraq is often considered part of Bilad Hashem, less frequently than it is, but it is. He says, they are all my brothers. They are all the same. So it makes that movement much more comfortable because he already feels like they belong. Palestinian man tells me, if we go back into the past, it was one country known as Bilad Hashem. It was only later that we were divided into many countries like Palestine and Jordan. And I have a third one from a woman, Palestinian woman, who, it's Britain's fault. They separated Bilad Hashem. The Western world has convinced us that borders are necessary. So Bilad Hashem's, the notion of Bilad Hashem, I hadn't mentioned this yet, it actually existed since the 7th century. The Ottoman Empire doesn't come in until 1299. So there's, 600 years of time where Bilad Hashem was an idea and it was part of other Islamic empires. It was, so it way predates even the Ottoman Empire. All the way back to the 7th century. There's a much more recent one, Bilad Hashem, again, to the 7th century. But there's another kind of geographic entity that a lot of people told me was incredibly powerful for their sense of belonging, but it's much more recent. It does not have as an old history, and it really just has a mid-20th century history because it was used as a political idea by a handful of leaders to try to unify the Arab countries. So the countries of the region I've been talking about right here, all predominantly Arab areas, but so much of the rest of North Africa and Southwest Asia are also majority Arabs, like huge ones of them. So this idea of it is called the Watan Arabi, which means the Arab homeland, became a very powerful part of kind of the Arab movement of the mid-20th centuries. So like 1950s, 60s, into the 1970s, this was a really, really powerful idea. It was taught in the schools, maps were made. This is a map of the Watan Arabi, where here, even in this map, there's no borders between any of the countries. The lines you see on here are latitude and longitude. They're not, they're not political borders here. So I saw lots and lots of maps. I collected maps. I actually have a huge collection of maps down the hall of maps that were made by Arab cartographers that conceptualize this place very differently than how we often think of it here in the United States. So lots of people also told me about it. It wasn't just the maps. They spoke about this. The Syrian man tells me, I'm close to Iraqis. I have family in Beirut who are all treated well. All of the Arab world is my country. I want the borders gone. Palestinian man says, even though a lot of things have happened, like the Western divisions, we are still one Arab nation. And a Palestinian woman says, the Arab world is like a table that was broke in half by the British. It was once whole. So again, these have effects though on where they move, right? And they feel like they belong. They see something there. They also clearly, have some remorse or regret that it's been broken up, right? Which is also a testament to, this idea of borders and boundaries that we are very much keen to preserve, in the 20th and 21st century. So even though, these last couple slides are really demonstrating these longer historical cultural connections are really important, and they think in ways that are like less borders, they also very much think of borders. In fact, the states that were created by the British and the French of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, as well as others, have become incredibly important to their identities. Even they're 100 years old and they resist them in some ways, they're also incredibly important. Syrians are Syrians. They love their country, Syria. Palestinians are Palestinian. They love Palestine, right? And they have very, very strong sense of the belonging to those particular places. So the states still absolutely, absolutely matter. I'm going to show you a couple examples of quotes, but also some other kind of examples in the landscape where you can actually see some of this happening. All right, I got a new computer recently. I'm not used, and I have dual monitors. So I'm not quite something. I'm sorry, I'm a little cumbersome here. I'm not quite used to my dual monitors yet. Okay. So yeah, and then I'm going to show you, as I just mentioned, I'm going to show you some examples about how they actually kind of recreate this like sense that you're in Syria or you're in Palestine while they're actually in Jordan. So they kind of take that state territory and they kind of remake it. Right. Let's start with Syrians. Again, I mentioned that Bilad al-Sham means like the country of Syria, Greater Syria. That's because the word al-Sham literally means Syria. That's how it's most directly translated. This is a photograph. I love this story. This is a photograph of an incredibly busy road through the Zatri refugee camp, which I showed that picture earlier of the playground in the tank. This is the same camp. It's this very, very busy marketplace. And they refer to it as Champs-Élysées, which I don't speak French well, so I'm sorry if I just really botched that. But the name Shem, again, means Syria. Champs-Élysées, though, is the very famous Parisian street that leads to the Arc de Triomphe, and that is just renowned for its very, very high-end shopping and restaurants. I think if I saw your heads, I think some of you might be nodding in agreement with me. You know what I'm talking about, right? But they actually took that idea because it was a very busy marketplace. Was not high-end, but very very busy marketplace, and they refer to it as Champs-Élysées, right? So they're kind of taking this notion that it's Syria. We also see here in this photograph the flag of the revolution, not the actual Assad regime's flag, but the flag of the revolution. And throughout this entire camp, every caravan was painted with Syrian flags, anthems, poems about Syria, about its home and its love. It really felt so much like the camp was part of Syria, and everybody who lived in the camp, everybody was Syrian. Palestinian camps can be mixed, so not all Palestinians, but in this, it was every single person was Syrian. And I talked to so many people who told me that they never felt closer to Syria than when they were in the camp, because they were with all their fellow Syrians and they were spending so much time together and they were in such need that they helped each other so much. They really recreated incredible tense senses of Syria while they were actually in Jordan. So a couple quotes that kind of hint at that, not the actual physical recreation of Syria in Jordan, but how they also actually just thought about Syria. One man, again, because of my obsession with maps, I love this quote. He says, the map of Syria is implanted in my head, right? And just talk about how he knows every inch of it and how it's very visceral and very, very meaningful to him. Another man tells me, the ground is Syria, then a castle here. Syria is my first and last homeland. So again, they try to remake it in the camp. They have that, but they're also at the same time thinking about going home, right? Because they clearly are not in Syria. For Palestinians, very similar. So there are 13 official Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, and these are very much feel like a little piece of Palestine in Jordan. There is a little bit more mixed, not just Palestinians live there. Probably about 90% of all the camps are Palestinian, but there's a little bit more of a mix. And these are open. That's because they're open. People can come and go as they like. The Jordanian government has a very, very strong presence in the Palestinian camps. They don't so much, though the military does in the Syrian camps, but like as administrative functioning, they don't in the Syrian ones like they do the Palestinian ones. And because of that, the Jordanian government really wants it to feel like Jordan. So there's tons of like the classic Jordanian iconography of nationalism there, like the pictures of the king and the crown prince, the Jordanian flags, the royal family, all those things are throughout there. But as soon as you go to somebody's home or shop, it's like Palestinian imagery and symbology everywhere. So here's like just a picture of a map that I took that was very common, where Palestinians were, trying to remember the homeland of Palestine that they once had. So it was very common in the camps to see that recreation. And lots of them told me about it too, right? Palestinian women saying, hey, my soul belongs in Palestine. She's lived in Jordan her whole life, but still her heart, her soul's in Palestine. Another woman telling me nothing else feels like home. Nothing can ever replace Palestine. And a man, it's not about borders. Palestine lives in my heart. So it's, again, something I was kind of a larger point bringing up about how they feel belonging. It's not necessarily about these borders that we are so accustomed to seeing on our world political maps. It can actually be quite different. So then what ends up happening, and maybe you can see the messiness is already occurring here. These refugees, some of them Syrians, have lived there, since 2012, which is relatively recent. And some Palestinians literally have been displaced when they were 5 years old in 1948 and have lived their entire lives there. Other Palestinians were born there. They're second, third generation Palestinian refugees. They've known no other life but to live in Jordan. So these connections with Jordan are very deep, particularly for Palestinians, as well as these memories and these ideals of Bilad al-Sham or al-Watan Arabi, the Arab homeland, and the greater Syria. But they still long for home. They still long for Syria. They still long for Palestine. And they all mix together and create these kind of, multi-layered and multi-scaled senses of identity and belonging. But inherently within all of it, there's a sense of sameness. There's a sense that there's something that connects all of them. And talked about this a lot. And I have a handful of examples I'm going to give you, both things they said and things I caught in the landscape as well. So again, in the Zatri refugee camps where this picture came from, this incredibly young woman I met and interviewed, she, it's hard not to get into her whole story. She's an incredible woman. She started teaching in the Zatri refugee camp as a second grade teacher. And to show her appreciation for the things that Jordan had given her, even though she was living in a highly securitized camp, she created this basically kind of like, I don't know what to call it, like placard to hang on a wall. They hadn't hung it on the wall yet at the school. This is in the school that she worked in, where she just took dried beans and she colored them with paint. They don't have a lot of resources in the camp, so she used what she could use. And she created this in Arabic. It says Jordan first in Arabic here, and then it has a Jordanian flag below it. She's Syrian, and she's really just created this thing called Jordan first. It was an official like slogan that Jordan had in the 1990s. So it wasn't something that she created on her own. And I asked her, why did you create this? And she said, to show my appreciation and thanks to the Jordanian people and to the Jordanian government for doing this. So she was taking on and really embracing this new opportunity she had in Jordan, and being very appreciative of it. And so many people kind of echoed that sentiment just through their words. Syrian man tells me, Jordan is my second home. So clearly Syria is still the first home, right? They've opened their borders and gave us life and security. Another Syrian man says, Jordan is very similar. Jordanians are very good to us. My wife got the call to go to Germany. That means that they got notified that they could resettle in Germany. That does not happen a lot. That's a very precious thing to happen. But we said, no, we want to be in Jordan because the community in Jordan is so similar to Syria. Okay. I'm about to wrap up here. Way in which we see Jordan and Palestine merging together. Also an example from the landscape, and then I'll give you some quotes. This was a family that I met, an older family. Both the husband and the wife were refugees from 1967. I want to say they were I think they didn't remember their migration into Jordan. They were so young. They married, they had their own kids. Their kids were like in their 20s by the time, maybe even 30s by the time I met them. But what you have here, this is their home. They don't live in a refugee camp. In the foreground here, you can see these, these kind of very simple kind of casually placed flags. These are the flags of Palestine. And then up this way, you can't see it as clearly. These are actually all symbols of Jordan. And actually, after the official slogan Jordan had that was called Jordan First, they changed it to called We Are All Jordan. And that's actually what that symbol is. So they're flying both the We Are All Jordan symbols alongside the Palestinian ones at the same time in the same home, because they're equally powerful and meaningful to this family. Some quotes from people I interviewed. A Palestinian man says, Palestine and Jordan are the same. They have the same dream. They're part of the Arab nation. So you can see how that idea of the Arab identity and the Arab nation comes back into play. A woman tells me, I love this one. I love the familial kind of reference and metaphor here. Jordan is the in-law, like when a woman marries and becomes part of another family. Right? So you're kind of adopted and you're brought into a new family, right? You still had something else, but you're brought into a new family. I feel like there's one more. Yes, there is. Okay. And then another Palestinian woman says, Jordan is my life. It's the life of my children. She raised all her children there. But if Palestine was free of Israel, then I'd live in Palestine. So obviously still that sense of longing for Palestine is there, but it's also that recognition, like this is home. This is where I raised my children. And these are I have so many more quotes that are very similar to these. I've just kind of picked things and quotes that are representative, and that's some of the main points. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up here. I have 2 summary slides, and then I'll be done. Some of this you've already heard me more or less introduce, so I'm more or less reiterating here. So these last several slides would have been really trying to get into that their senses of belonging are multiple, right? They also overlap, and that they might seem contradictory at first, but if you think about kind of this, how one would live their life and have these multi-scaled and multi-layered aspects of their own identity, then it does actually make sense. And that's why I use the term hybrid in the previous slides. These senses of belonging have immense impacts on how, where they move, where they choose to move, and where they choose to stay. Like one of those last quotes, the family that decided not to go to Germany, which is a much wealthier country with many more opportunities than Jordan has. And of course, then it also helps how they cope and how they actually do become resilient and how they are able to rebuild their lives, how a family can have this beautiful home, like in the last picture I just showed you, even though they were refugees, and be very successful. And a point here too, as a geographer, I'm very much a political geographer. A lot of things that I study and I teach about in my classes about states and boundaries and borders. And a lot of the story I'm trying to tell here is that people don't always live their lives confined to or thinking about the official borders that are on the map, that other borders, other places, other more zonal places without borders are actually incredibly significant and still very geographical, but very significant in their lives. So the way we think about borders is really just one way to think about belonging in geography. And although I did not say this explicitly, I hope that these quotes and just knowing, the decades and decades and decades for Palestinians that they've been refugees here, what it also indicates is their resilience and their strength. That these are not people who kind of just gave up. In addition to, this concern and discourse sometimes in these wealthier Western states that we live in of them being threats, there's often this image that they're victims of war. And I would say, particularly with the Syrians I met, because when I met Syrians, they were coming immediately from war. The Palestinians I met had not, most of them had never experienced conflict. They were victimized. They had incredible challenges, but incredible strength, incredible resilience, and rebuilt their lives and done incredibly well. And that also goes for the Iraqi refugees. So the last of my slides then, kind of bringing it back to the point of Jordan and the more kind of global perspective that I started with. Jordan is quite a poor country, has almost no natural resources, but nevertheless, it's been open to different migrations of refugees for almost its entire history, 2 years into its independence, and has welcomed millions upon millions upon millions of refugees. Refugees are the norm in Jordan. They're not the exception, and again, they're not a threat. Let me explain this picture that was the beginning of the presentation as well. So this was a photograph I took in 2015 or 16 maybe. A Syrian family had actually smuggled themselves out of the Zatri refugee camp. This is where you get a tent like that, is in Zatri. And the conditions in Zatri were rough, to say it nicely. And a lot of people would smuggle themselves out. It wasn't easy to do. Usually kind of had a bribe of the border security guard to get you out, but they did. So they got the tent out, and it's illegal to do that. It's illegal to get out. It's also illegal to steal the tent. But they did that out of desperation and the need to get out of these really deplorable conditions of the camp. I'm sorry. They set up their tent though in the yard of a Jordanian family that they knew, and this was on a main road, like in plain sight. I didn't know this family. I did not interview them. Was literally just driving by, stopped to take a picture. And this is representative of how normal it is to be a refugee in Jordan and how Jordan does welcome refugees, because this is highly illegal, what you're seeing here in this picture, but the cops just turned a blind eye to it. Even though there's laws against it, they were like, people are suffering, they're trying to do the best they can do, and they really would just turn a blind eye to a lot of it. It was really quite remarkable. Over the years, these things stopped being as common because refugees were able to get apartments, which were much better than tents, but for some time during the crisis, it was not uncommon to see something like this on the side of the road. Okay, so that is it. I just have one little slide that officially proves that I am done with a little thank you and questions.
Wow, that's a lot of really, really interesting information. I have a whole page of notes here. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, but I have a bunch.
Okay.
Questions. So people may just still be processing like I am.
Okay. There are a lot of holes I left there. There's a million details about, the way the international refugee system works, what the United States does, what the EU does, what Jordan does. There's a million things going on here.
Well, I think this is a great start to build a case study for AP Geography with migration. So I think that's where I'm going. Greg, question.
Yes, I do have a question. I think, and I've been great stuff, by the way, and I'm also a scholar of Palestine. In your book, you talked about, I can't remember what it said, something about leveraging the crisis of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the discourse when it comes to Jordan is that Jordan doesn't want them, the Jordanians hate them. Is that part of what you're talking about by leveraging this crisis of fear?
No, I mean, Jordanians, they're actually very welcoming to them. There are some Jordanians that they don't like that their kids' school got split into dual shifts, right? And they're upset that their children, their Jordanian children, aren't getting as much education. They're also upset that the prices of rents have gone up a lot because landlords, this is not the Syrians' fault, but the landlords are like, hey, I can make more money and exploit you, right? So there are tensions there, but no, they actually accept the refugees very, very, very much so. They go out of their way, Jordanians go out of their way, particularly the Palestinians there have gone out of their way to help Syrians because they recognize themselves. They were also, even though them personally, they might not have, they were, probably born in Jordan, but their grandparents or their parents were refugees. So there is a sense of support. I mean, it's not perfect, but no, it's actually really welcoming. So the crisis of fear is one that I talk about in the book, and I didn't really emphasize that here. I kind of did note it, but the EU, 2014, 2015, the United States under the Trump administration, when Syrian refugees were at the height of their migrations and they're fleeing the country, people shut down, the infamous photograph of Aylan Kurdi, the lifeless, Syrian Kurdish boy that washed up ashore in Turkey, that was kind of the peak of it. But the EU and their border security agency is called Frontex, had continued and still to this day to police both the maritime and the land boundaries to make sure, refugees aren't getting in. Afghans have been so high since the United States withdrew 2 summers ago. And, the United States, Trump signed, as one of his first acts as president, he signed what it became known as the Muslim ban, that banned Muslims from, you know, majority countries, many majority countries, but it also bans Syrian refugees indefinitely. So that's the fear, and that I talk about in the book, the way that the global north, the wealthy countries of the global north have responded. When, again, it was a stat I gave earlier in the presentation, only 9% of all refugees are actually resettled in the global north. And they resettle 1% every year. So the United States, I mean, we have, you know, the president has the power through our legislation to set the refugee cap. And it varies president by president. Actually, Ronald Reagan had like some of the highest caps. And it's gone up and down over the years. Obama's got pretty high. Trump's went very, very low. Biden's came back up a bit. I think it might be about 10,000. But if you, I mean, put 10,000 refugees in the context of 117 million, it's insignificant. I mean, it's not insignificant to those 10,000, right? It's fantastic. But yeah, so that's the culture of fear. And it comes, I mean, frankly, and it's actually a research project I've been doing in West Virginia. I think it really just comes down to anti-Muslim discrimination. I really just think it's the issue here is, yes, anti-Muslim discrimination.
Thank
I
you.
have a follow-up question to like Greg's question. The idea or the discourse of fear, do you think there's a difference between how Syrian refugees are seen in the camps versus the ones who are not part of the camps? Because it feels like there's kind of a resistance to the ones who live outside the camps because of the same idea we have here. They are taking our jobs. There's the higher prices. And knowing from friends, I'm originally from Syria, and having some friends who live in Jordan express how Jordanians are kind of resistant to them in so many ways. And also they can be like, there's some kind of discrimination. So do you think the treatment is different between those who reside in the camps and those who are outside of the camps? There's one question. And go ahead. I'll ask the second.
Go ahead. You mean, so how the Jordanians are perceiving Syrians in the camp versus, I think they definitely see the ones in the camp as being in the camp. They're off. They don't have to worry about them. They're in like this, they literally are in this like securitized area that they can't get out. So they're not a concern to them. Although Jordanians know that money is still getting funneled to the camps, right? And there's only so much money. In fact, that was something Palestinians had quite a lot of grievances towards the Syrians, because they were like, we're refugees too, but they're getting a lot more money than we are, right? I mean, and to the Palestinians, like you've been here for 40 years though, they literally just experience war and trauma. You know, there's a little bit of difference there. Yeah, there is discrimination. I met this Syrian woman who I'll never forget, her telling me the story about taking her child. She lived in a city, I think it was in Erbil, which is the second largest city in Jordan. It was so sad. And she took her kid to a playground, like a 6-year-old kid. It was swinging, and maybe because their clothes were kind of, this is what she said, her clothes they were kind of ratty and dirty clothes. They didn't have like nice new clothes. Another kid came in and realized they were Syrian refugees. And this kid like told her son to get off the swing, like he couldn't belong there. You know, she told me the story and she's like crying. She's like her baby, and it's, you know, so challenging, right? So yeah, there are all sorts of discriminations, right? But they were allowed in. And when I talked to Jordanians and Palestinian Jordanians, you know, about Syrians, their view was always one still of compassion. It was frustration for the lack of resources, right? But that was usually more directed at the government for not having enough money to help everybody equally. Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't change the fact that, you know, you're breaking this woman's heart, you know, watching her son be discriminated against on a swing set, right? But yeah, so I mean, I don't think it's a fear. I think when I talk in the book about the culture, the crisis and the fear of crisis, it's really about violence and terrorism. And I think that's a very false discourse, right? And I think we know, if you look at the data, it's when there's violence in this country, it's not typically happening from a refugee or a Muslim American or a Muslim immigrant, right? It's happening from a very dominant culture here.
Thank you. The other question I have is, like, does gender affect how the displacement or identity is being perceived? Did you see like any difference in how?
So I saw that with the Palestinians a lot. And in fact, it was even, I think one quote I gave about raising your children. Yeah. So because the Palestinians have been there so much longer, because they've raised their own families there, and there are very traditional gender roles there, right? The women, I think this sense of building a family and raising your children embedded them much, much more in Jordan than the men, who maintained much more outrightly political stances. The women were so much more concerned, and I saw this, I actually wrote a different paper, but it's not in the book, but it was something I wrote about elsewhere. They were so much more concerned in like caretaking, homemaking, and raising the children. They were very aware of the injustices that are happening against Palestinians. They very much had quotes like, "Oh, I want to go back to Palestine," but the men are much more overtly political. And I think that, yeah, that gendered division of labor there, of homemaking versus the more outwardly public stature that men have, did make a difference. It absolutely made a difference. I don't think I saw that with the Syrians as much, though, and that might just be because of how long they had been there. The Syrian men, so different than Palestinian men. Syrians can't work in Jordan. And this is like, they want to work, and like there's engineers and doctors and highly skilled people who could do amazing things, but they're not allowed to work, so they work under the table. There's a system of getting a permit, but it's expensive, and it takes months and months and months. They can only work certain sectors legally, so they end up working illegally, which is so challenging, because if they get caught, they could go to the camp or to be deported. But men can't work. And because women, for whatever reason, they were able to get more under the table jobs, doing things like sewing is a really common one, housekeeping, mostly it's really sewing though. So many of them are then working. So the women end up having all sorts of power in the household that they never had before, because they're making the money. Whereas men feel demasculated. So there's like that dynamic is totally different than the Palestinian dynamic. But yeah, the men in the Syrian families, yeah, are struggling more with like gender roles switching a little bit. Yeah, it's a whole other thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, great questions. And I'm sure there are a lot more out there. So, Karen, thank you so much for giving up your Wednesday evening. And I know your family's at home recovering from soccer practice and stuff. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in a couple of weeks. So thank you everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks for your questions. Thank you, everybody.